Hello everyone, thank you for joining me for the latest in the National Archives series of online talks. My name is Jessica Nelson and I'm the head of pre-modern legal and map collections at the National Archives, and I'm going to be talking about the Lancashire witch scare of 1633 to 1634. On the 16th of May 1634, Sir William Pelham wrote to his brother-in-law Edward, Viscount Conway. They were regular correspondents, exchanging news and gossip. Sir William wrote with barely disguised glee that, quote, "the news from the country is of a huge pack of witches which are lately discovered in Lancashire, whereof it is said 19 are condemned, and there are at least 60 already discovered, and yet daily there are more revealed. They have done much harm. It is suspected that they had a hand in raising the great storm, wherein his Majesty was in so great a danger at sea in Scotland." This shocking news is the first trace in the official record of the Lancashire witch scare that took place in the mid-1630s. While it may have been news to Viscount Conway, who was living on his estate in Ireland at the time, it was clearly already being widely reported in England. Sir William's wording, "it is said" and "it is suspected," show that the rumour mill was in full swing. It is little wonder that the appearance of witches in Lancashire was the proverbial talk of the town. In the previous generation, a witch scare in that same county had led to the deaths by hanging of 10 people, and the clerk of the court had written and published a detailed account of the proceedings, which had disseminated the story across the kingdom. How could it be that so soon afterwards more witches were to be found in the same region? Moreover, Sir William's mention of the suspicion that these witches had raised a storm in Scotland, threatening the life of the king, Charles I, shows another chord that these tales had. Charles I's father, James VI and First, had been a firm believer in witchcraft, and his enthusiasm for witch hunting was in part based upon his belief that in 1590 a group of witches in North Berwick had attempted to kill him by whipping up a great storm while he was at sea. In this single letter, then, we can see elements of gossip and folk memory that were so important in many early modern witch scares. Before we delve deeper into this fascinating story, we should go backwards a little. Witch beliefs were nothing new in England, and neither was official action against them. Nonetheless, for hundreds of years, witchcraft did not appear to be particularly bothersome. Medieval witchcraft in England was frequently what has been described as treason cum sorcery, with isolated individuals being accused of using magical practices in plots against the king or the royal family, but it does not seem to have been perceived as a major problem, either by the government or by ordinary people. Our first key date in the establishment of witchcraft as a major concern is 1563, when the government of Elizabeth I passed a Witchcraft Act, re-establishing witchcraft as a felony, meaning it came under the jurisdiction of the common law courts, not the ecclesiastical courts. This act was bolstered by James VI and First in 1604. Thus it is from the last third of the 16th century that we see witch trials in the secular courts in increasing numbers, and accompanying them, an increasing body of popular literature describing these trials in often lurid detail. It is from these pamphlets that we know so much about the first Pendlewitch scare, one of the most infamous witch trials in English history, which took place in 1612. These events, which resulted in the executions of 9 women and 1 man, were largely fueled by accusations and counter-accusations made between and within 2 families and their close neighbours. The evidence at the trial of 9-year-old Jeanette Device did much to condemn to death her own mother and older brother and sister. In particular, Jeanette described a great assembly and feast of witches at the house where her grandmother and sister lived. And this slide shows a photograph of Roughly Old Hall from the collections at the National Archives. This was reputed to be the hall where some of the witches had lived during the first Pendle witch scare, although I'm afraid to say there's no very good evidence for that at all. As we turn to look at the second Pendle witch scare, it's worth bearing in mind some of the key factors which the first trials highlight about witch scares in the early 17th century. The importance of accusations within the local community, the evidence of a child, and the overall willingness of the local justices and officials to accept the possibility of a community being full of witches. The second Pendlewitch scare took place just over 20 years later, within living memory of these earlier events. As with the first scare, the assize records of the trial unfortunately have not survived. This case too was the subject of a pamphlet from which we can learn a great deal about the trial, and we also have a wealth of evidence in the records of the Privy Council and the state papers held at the National Archives. So what actually happened? By the time Sir William Conway wrote to his brother-in-law in May 1634, he was able to relay that around 19 were already condemned, so clearly much activity, including the trial, had already taken place. And what we know of these initial events comes mostly from a pamphlet written later by John, a local curate. He wrote that in November 1633, a young boy, Edmund Robinson, had started telling stories about people within his community being witches and making accusations against them. Following his initial tales, his father, also called Edmund, we are told, quote, did make a practice to go from church to church that the boy might reveal and discover witches, pretending that there was a great number at the pretended meeting whose faces he could know, and by that means they got a good living. The tone of the extract makes it clear that even at this stage, not everyone was convinced by the boy's tales. Curate Webster claims that he attempted to talk to the boy alone in order to get the truth out of him, but was prevented from doing so by those with the child. By February 1634, the accusations had come to the attention of the local magistrates, who took the statements of Edmund Robinson and his father, Edmund Sr. It is worth noting the gap of 3 months between the initial accusations and the beginning of the legal investigation, perhaps suggesting reluctance on the part of the magistrates. But once the formal investigation was underway, more people came forward with accusations, resulting in a large number of women and a few men being sent to trial at the Lancashire Assizes. Of these, around 19 were found guilty. To anyone over the age of about 35 who could remember the first Pendlewitch scare, this must all have seemed scarily familiar. But it is at this point that the events of the second Pendlewitch scare significantly diverge from those of the first. As we have seen, from the beginning there seems to have been some doubts about the veracity of young Edmund Robinson's claims. As we have also seen, they swiftly became the talk of the kingdom. Our pamphleteer tells us that the judge at the assizes was himself not satisfied with the evidence, and thus, despite the guilty verdict, granted the witches a reprieve and referred the matter to His Majesty and the Privy Council, the small group of senior politicians at the heart of early modern government. As a result, on the 16th of May 1634, the same day that Conway wrote with such excitement to his brother-in-law, the registers of the Privy Council, held at the National Archives, note that writs of habeas corpus should be issued so that those persons tried and convicted of witchcraft at the Lancashire Assizes should be brought to London to appear before the Council. And this slide is an image of that entry on the Privy Council register. The persons are named, and you can see their names at the bottom of the image there, as Margaret Johnson, John Spencer and Mary his daughter, Jeanette Hargreave, Alice Higgin, Francis Dickinson and Jeanette Loynd. It should be said that in the register of the Privy Council there is no hint of scepticism. Indeed, it refers in the text to the principal and most notorious offenders. A couple of weeks later, on the 31st of May, the registers show that an explanatory note was written to the Bishop of Chester, requiring him to call those persons before him, examine him, and send the examinations to the council. A further note was sent to an official to visit the house of Edmund Robinson Sr. and to tell him that he has express instructions to take into his charge Robinson's son, Edmund Robinson Jr., that discovered the witches, and escort the latter to the council. On the 15th of June, John Bridgeman, the Bishop of Chester, wrote back. Here's an image of the letter that he wrote. Bridgeman was an experienced and serious churchman. His appointment to the Bishopric of Chester reflected the royal policy of installing safe hands in areas which had been strongly affected by both Catholic recusancy and by Puritanism. He was then probably not the sort of churchman to easily believe accusations of witchcraft. Bridgeman's letter begins by reporting that of the 7 people he has been asked to examine, 3 had already died in jail, and a 4th was laid sick past hope of recovery, all of which speaks volumes for the conditions in 17th-century jails. He goes on to say that he has examined the remaining 3 and begins by describing his encounter with the old woman called Margaret Johnson, alias the penitent witch. And he writes, "With tears in her eyes, after mine exhortations to her, she replied, I will not add to sin. I have already done enough, nay, too much, and therefore will not increase it by telling untruth. I pray God I may repent." And then she confessed as is set down in her examination, often acknowledging that she was a witch, but more often faulting in the particulars and circumstances of her actions, as one having a strong imagination of the former, but also of too mean a memory to retain or relate the other. Turning to the remaining 2 women, he wrote, "I hold it my duty to signify what I find by lamentable experiences. Conceit and malice are so powerful with many in these parts, and will easily afford on oath to work revenge on their neighbour." And he goes on to share the deposition of a local woman, backed up by others, who told him at Lancaster that Robinson Senior had asked for 40 shillings from Dickinson, one of the accused, in order not to testify against her. While Bridgeman left the ultimate judgment to the Privy Council, it is clear from the information that he chose to share in this letter that he believed that the accusations against the women emanated from malice and even blackmail. In the case of Margaret Johnson, the old woman who had actually confessed to being a witch, the details which Bridgeman provided as context to her examination show that he knew very well that he was dealing with an old, confused and frightened woman. The fact that he says she had too mean a memory to be able to relate the details of her supposed offences strongly suggests that she was suffering from what we would now call dementia. Having provided this context to his recipients, Bridgeman then enclosed copies of the examinations themselves. They make fascinating and horrifying reading. We must remember when looking at these documents that these are not the words of the women themselves. What the women actually said has been mediated by the clerk recording the examinations, and of course by Bridgeman himself. For example, the word malice, already used by Bridgeman in his own letter, comes up several times, and that is quite possibly the term that the bishop thought appropriate to use to encapsulate what the women were saying, rather than the term that they used themselves. Nevertheless, these examinations take us as close as we can get to the voices of the women caught up in these appalling events. First of all, Margaret Johnson, the penitent witch, who the bishop had already told his readers is upset and confused. Her examination makes for uncomfortable reading. She began by saying, quote, "that she hath been a witch about 6 years last past, and that she was brought thereto upon some troubles and vexations of her bad neighbours. And about that time, walking in the highway, there appeared to her a man in black attire, who said to her, if she would give him her soul, she would want nothing, but should have power to hurt whom she wants, both man and beast. But she then refused, and thereupon he vanished. But apparently he approached her again and again, until finally she gave in, and he gave her into her hand some silver and gold, as she thought, but it vanished as soon again, and she knoweth not how, for she was ever bare and poor, though he oft gave her the like. And she saith that most commonly at his coming to her, he hath the use of her body, and she had some lust and pleasure thereby. And after this he appeared to her in other shapes, and sometimes as a brown-coloured dog, sometimes as a white cat, and at other times like a hare, and as those shapes he did suck her blood at 2 dugs or paps in her privy parts." But despite apparently considering herself to be a witch, Johnson went on to say that she never hurt man or woman by witchcraft, except perhaps one man, and she seems confused on the details. Further, Johnson had no intention of incriminating any of the people accused alongside her. She says that there were 7 or 8 other of her neighbours who were witches, but most of them are dead, and that the rest of the witches with her condemned were unknown to her till she was committed, and she never was acquainted or in company with any of them before. Indeed, she goes on to say how many of those imprisoned with her daily pray and read the Psalms and appear to be godly folk, before adding that she herself did diligently frequent the church till her foul compact with the devil, but from there she seldom went to any church. Johnson's tale, then, has many of the hallmarks of the early modern witch scares. She is an elderly widow, a vulnerable position socially and economically. She is poor. In terms of the witchcraft itself, Her story of meeting a man dressed in black, of his transformation into various familiars, and of physical intimacy with the familiars are all tropes which are found time and time again in accusations of witchcraft, doubtless shaped by the popular demonologies and pamphlets describing previous witch scares. Indeed, the examination even provides us with the term compact with the devil, lest there be any doubt about what has gone on. The two other examinations are equally illuminating, although completely different in tone. Mary Spencer, aged about 20, gives a stout and spirited defence of herself, utterly denying that she had any knowledge of witchcraft or that she had hurt anybody thereby. Instead, she turned the attention to a neighbour who had accused her, Nicholas Cunliffe, who she said had borne malice to her and her parents for several years, and thus had wrongfully accused them. Cunliffe had apparently said that her pail, her bucket, used to come running to her of its own accord upon her call because she had bewitched it. But Spencer provides the simple explanation that when she was a girl and was sent to get water from the well, she sometimes used to run down the hill, rolling her pail down the hill behind her and calling to it. A childish amusement and very far from witchcraft. She also explains that she would have answered for herself at the last assizes, quote, but the wind was so loud and the throng so great as she could not hear the evidence against her. This in itself is a fascinating insight into the extent to which the frenzied atmosphere of the court could itself influence the outcome of the case. But Spencer has no problems defending herself to the bishop. Her defence of herself continues with an account of how she used to attend church at Burnley every Sunday and repeated the prayers and preaching to her parents at home. To drive home the point that she was a good Christian, Spencer recited the Creed and the Lord's Prayer before the bishop. The record of the examination ends with a statement that, quote, she is not afraid of death, for she hopes it will make an entrance for her into heaven. Next up is Frances Dickinson. She seems to be a proponent of the attack as a form of defence school, because the impression from her examination is that she certainly came out swinging. Like Spencer, she utterly denied the charges and went on to claim that, quote, the boy who accused her hath much wronged her out of malice, as she believes. She proceeds to explain that there was a disagreement between Edmund Robinson Sr. and her husband over the purchase of a cow, and that he hath ever since maligned her and her husband. She then stated that she also had a disagreement with another accuser over the purchase of butter. Most damningly, though, she lastly claims that Edmund Robinson Sr. promised via a named intermediary that if her husband paid him 40 shillings, neither he nor his son would say anything against her. Bridgeman did what was required of him and submitted these examinations to the Privy Council. Shortly afterwards, the Council took the step of appointing a group of surgeons, including the King's physician, Dr. William Harvey, to assemble a group of midwives and together examine the bodies of the women and report on what they had found. Of course, the intention of this was not to take a general survey of their health. The group was to look for physical marks that might be evidence of witchcraft, specifically evidence that familiars had sucked blood from the women's bodies. The belief in familiars, in demonic animal spirits which witches were thought to own, seems to have been a peculiarly English element in witch beliefs. As we have heard, Margaret Johnson told her examiner a story which fitted neatly with this understanding. The women were taken from the Ship Tavern in Greenwich, where they were being held, to the Surgeons' Hall in Mugwell Street for examination, and as a complete aside, there is still a barber surgeon's hall in what we now call Monkwell Street on the edge of the City of London, and it's still home to the Worshipful Company of Barbers. The report of the surgeons and midwives shown here survives in the State Papers. It states that, quote, on the bodies of Jeanette Hargreaves, Frances Dickinson and Mary Spencer, nothing unnatural, neither in their cervix or any other parts of their bodies, nothing like a teat or mark nor any sign that any further things hath ever been. And note that Jeanette Hargreaves, whom Bishop Bridgeman had reported to be at death's door, was not spared this incredibly intrusive physical examination. Of Margaret Johnson, it states that they did find 2 marks in the private parts of her body as she had herself described. But there was nothing terribly odd about them, and that they certainly did not produce any blood for familiars to suck on. So at this point, the Privy Council had, on the one hand, the accusations made at the Assizes trial against these women, and on the other hand, counterclaims from the accused women explaining why the accusations had been made in the first place, no conclusive physical evidence, in fact, pretty much no physical evidence at all, and a single confession from an elderly woman who the Bishop of Chester himself considered to be confused and unreliable. So the councillors took the next logical step. They sent the Chief Justice of Middlesex, a man called George Long, to interview Edmund Robinson, the boy upon whose claims the entire edifice had been built. 2 reports of the examinations of young Robinson survive, both of which provide fascinating detail about the accusations themselves and how they had come about, revealing a rare insight into a child's view of an early modern rural community. Looking first at the accusations themselves, Edmund stated that he had claimed that he had found 2 greyhounds in the forest and did, quote, tie these greyhounds to a bush and did beat them, and that thereupon the one of them did presently assume the shape of a woman and the other of a boy, and that the woman did offer this examinant 12 pence to say nothing, and that she put a bridle on the boy's mouth, and the boy became a white horse, and took up this examinee and carried him on his back to a place called Horstones in Pendle Forest, where he said he saw a number of 60 persons gathered together who did there give the examinant meat. And he relates the names of some of the people who he claimed to have seen at this witch feast. We do not know how long it took for Edmund to admit the truth to Justice Long, or the level of questioning that was put to him. Perhaps, a small boy being examined alone and far from home, he confessed very quickly. This is certainly the impression given in the reports, where he admits that it was all false and feigned, and a mere fiction of his own. But why had he done all this? It would seem for an age-old reason, to get out of trouble. Quote, he saith that the reason why he so invented the said talk was, he was appointed one time to fetch home his mother's kine, that is her cattle, but did not do it, but went to play with other children, and being come home and fearing lest his father or mother would beat him for neglecting to bring home the kine, he made this tale for an excuse, and for no other end or purpose. But then, as can so often happen, he enjoyed the attention that his tales got him. Afterwards, perceiving that many folks gave care unto him and believed him, and that he spoke, he grew confident in it more and more. And he told the story several times, and sometimes added one thing to it, and sometimes another. Edmund's tales clearly took on a life of their own, and as we have seen, other local people came forward to accuse these women. At the same time, though, we've seen evidence that there was also plenty of scepticism in the country, including from the assize judge himself, so we cannot simply dismiss the whole affair as the superstitions of primitive people. Why then did so many in this particular community take Edmund's stories so seriously? We can go some way to answering this using the evidence provided by Edmund himself in his examinations. I'm quoting from the report. He saith that he had divers and several times heard the neighbours talk amongst themselves as they sat together of a witch feast that was kept at a place called Mocking Tower in Pendle Forest in the county of Lancaster about 20 years since. To which feast divers witches come, and many of them were apprehended and executed at Lancaster for witchcraft. And thereupon he framed these tales of this coming the persons aforesaid, because he had heard divers of the neighbours repute them to be witches, therefore he names them to be some of these whom he had seen at Horstones. Little Edmund went on to describe in some detail who he had heard say what and about whom. And namely, he hath heard one Edmund Stevenson say that he was very troubled with the said Dickinson his wife in this time of sickness, and he suspected her. And he had heard Robert Smith, another neighbour, say that his wife, lying upon her deathbed, did accuse Jeanette Hargreaves to be the cause of her death. And he had heard William Nutter, his wife, say that Jeanette Device and William Device had bewitched her. And so it was reported by those neighbours that watched with her in sickness. And it was generally spoken that Bevis, his wife, who went a begging, was commonly taken for a witch. And he had heard John Smith say that the wife of John Lloyd had laid his hands upon a cow, after which she never rose. And having heard the story of the meeting of the witches at Mocking Tower, it came in his head to make the like tale of a meeting at Horstones in the forest aforesaid, at which place he had been with his father at some time, as he built it for one Thomas Robinson to dwell in. So young Edmund had heard the tales about the first Pendle witch scare, and he had heard his neighbours gossip maliciously about one another and other neighbours, and he had visited a tower or a house where his father had worked as a mason. And he put all these elements together into his own story, tapping into the community's memory of the witches who had been found in Pendle 20 years before, exploiting existing tensions and rumours amongst his neighbours, and making it all the more believable by providing a real physical setting in which to locate his tale. Two further small twists may have added to the credibility of the boy's tales. The eagle-eared amongst you may have heard in the boy's evidence the mention of the name Jeanette Device. Although not one of the women taken to London, she was one of those accused. We don't know for sure, but it is possible that this is the same Jeanette Device who was the star witness at the witch trials earlier in the century, where she had made accusations against her own family. If that was the case, then her family already would have had the taint of witchcraft, which might have made these stories all the more believable. Further, one of the justices charged with the initial investigation into Edmund Robinson's stories was John Starkey. As a child, this Starkey, along with his sister, had started having fits, leading his father to believe that the children were possessed by the devil. This possession had eventually led to a man being executed for witchcraft. If Starkey genuinely believed that he himself had been a victim of witchcraft, then it seems likely that he would have been more likely to believe the accusations of Robinson and his fellows. Edmund Robinson was only 10 years old. He cannot possibly have known or anticipated that the bandwagon of his story would be so enthusiastically jumped upon, including by his own father. And as such, he can hardly be blamed for what happened in the months after he first came up with his tall tale. The same might not, though, be said for Edmund Robinson Sr. In the report of the second examination of the boy, we can infer that George Long, the justice, asked him if anyone put him up to it, for the report states that Edmund utterly denied that he was advised to make the said declaration concerning the said witches, insisting again that it was all his own invention. The last that we hear from him in the state papers is that he saith he is very sorry for that he hath said, and wishes heartily that if he were to speak, for he would never say it. I'm sure that his father wished that too. Shortly after the Privy Council received the reports of the examinations from the Bishop of Chester, Edmund Robinson Sr. had been imprisoned in the Gatehouse prison in Westminster. He was so desperate to put his side of the story across that we have two short reports of examinations of him in July, in which he asserted that he never believed his son's tales and that the investigation of them was driven by the officials in Lancashire. He also utterly denied the accusations that he had attempted to extort money from anyone to change his evidence. I'm afraid that there is no happy ending. We do not know what happened to Edmund and his father. The curate who wrote the pamphlet that we talked about above mentioned that at the time of writing, a few years later, Edmund was still alive, and indeed that they had discussed the case and that he had admitted that his father encouraged the stories. Of the women accused, we must remember first of all that only a handful of those initially tried were sent to London for further examination at all, and indeed some of them had already died in jail. In July 1636, 2 years after these investigations took place, 10 of those accused were still in prison in Lancaster, including Jeanette Hargreaves, Mary Spencer, and Frances Dickinson. Perhaps old Margaret Johnson, the penitent witch, had died in the meantime. No reason is given for their continued imprisonment. It may be that the Privy Council was willing to uphold their reprieve from the sentence of death, but not willing to completely overturn their convictions. Having said that, we can see in this second witch scare a degree of scepticism which had not existed during the first scare 20-odd years earlier, and while there continue to be regular trials of witches at the Lancaster Assizes, the surviving records show that there was a steady increase in the frequency with which those accused of witchcraft were found not guilty. That's the end of my talk for today. I hope you've enjoyed it, and if you would like to take part in the question and answer, then you can do that using the Q&A function. Thanks very much for listening.